Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Michaels, and I'm the IEN Senior Fellow at eBay. And I'd like to welcome all of you to eBay's seminar series on U.S. foreign policy. The series is part of a joint initiative of eBay and the Barcelona Institute for North American Studies, and it aims to promote discussion of U.S. foreign policy related topics by inviting scholars from the social sciences and humanities to share their research and provide their insights. This evening, we'll be focusing on the insights that political psychology and specifically the study of somatic markers can offer in relation to the study of U.S. foreign policy decision-making. And to enlighten us on this topic, it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome one of the world's foremost authorities on political psychology and U.S. foreign policy, Professor David Houghton, who I guess until recently was working full-time at the U.S. Naval War College, is still affiliated with them. He also has previously taught at the universities of Pittsburgh, Central Florida, the University of Essex, and King's College London. At the moment, he's actually also a fellow of the London School of Economics, so he's a turncoat as far as I'm concerned, given that he went to LSE as opposed to King's, but I'll leave that for another discussion. In the field of political psychology, David's books are required reading. In any sort of academic work on political psychology and U.S. foreign policy, is sort of guaranteed to make at least one reference to David's work. Over the course of his academic career, David has produced many books, including The Decision Point, published by Oxford University Press in 2012, A Citizen's Guide to American Foreign Policy, published by Routledge in 2013, but my favorite is his first major work, U.S. Foreign Policy and the Iran Hostage Crisis, published by Cambridge University Press. And in addition to his books, he has published numerous academic articles in such journals as Security Studies, the British Journal of Political Science, Political Psychology, and Terrorism and Political Violence, among others. Some of the work that he's will be presenting tonight appears in this article in Foreign Policy Analysis, Visceral Politics and its Impact on U.S. Foreign Policy Decision-Making, published earlier this year. He's also published a chapter in a little-known book that I co-edited entitled Scripting Middle East Leaders, The Impact of Leadership Perceptions on U.S. and U.K. Foreign Policy. I sort of have to mention that again. Apologies, David. It was in the course of preparing that book that I first had the opportunity to meet David. And several years later, I had the good fortune of working with him at King's College before he returned to the U.S. And took up the job at Newport. So David, welcome back to the seminar series, and I very much look forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
So good morning, or good afternoon. I know it's about 4 p.m. over there in Barcelona, and it's 10 a.m. here. And here is, I should say, is Orlando, Florida, where I am at the moment. So, and it's a beautiful day, and I hope it is in Barcelona as well. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you again at eBay, and I just so wish I was over there in Barcelona to talk to you in person. But this is a pretty good replacement, pretty good second. And I'm going to talk to you today, as Jeff said, about somatic markers in American foreign policy. And this is a very, very new topic indeed. In fact, it's so new that it hasn't really been, we haven't really published the topic yet. And the basis of the talk that I'm going to give today is an article which is coming out in Foreign Policy Analysis in January. So not even out yet, but you have access to it. If you're a member of the ISA or the Foreign Policy Analysis community, you'll have access to this already. But the article Visceral Politics and its implications for foreign policy decision-making is coming out in January. And this is really the inspiration for the talk that I'm going to give today. As an overview, what I'm going to cover, three basic things. First of all, I'm going to talk about what the somatic marker thesis is, because it's important to get that down clearly to begin with. Somatic marker theory is not usually that familiar to political scientists. It's familiar to behavioral economists, I think, but not really. Not much work has been done in political science using this. So I'm going to talk about what it is. Then I'm going to illustrate the theory with some very brief illustrations drawn from the lives of former President William McKinley, former Defense Secretary, US Defense Secretary Robert Gates, and former National Security Advisor in the United States, Susan Rice. I'm going to use those three examples. For time reasons, I may not get to any more than that, but and then finally draw some caveats and conclusions. Now, the study of emotion and decision making is fashionable. It's something which is an awful lot of people have started to do recently. But even though it's fashionable, I think it is very often, if you look at the research which has been done, it's a little bit vague in the sense that emotion is very good for helping us explain the style of decision making, but it's not quite as good as an explanation of the precise options which people choose. I've always been interested in the study of decision making, in why people choose option A rather than option B, for instance. Why do people choose the options that they do? I think any good theory of decision making has to be able to do that, as well as just explain the generalities style of decision making. So it's fashionable, but it's also been used in rather vague ways, I think. And what appeals to me about the somatic marker hypothesis, as it's called in the literature, is that it's able to explain why we pick one option rather than another. Unlike a lot of the theories which have already been published relating emotion to foreign policy decision making, the somatic marker hypothesis is able to explain the details of decision making, why a particular option is chosen, why A rather than B, why X rather than Y. The somatic marker hypothesis or theory can do that. And that's what's always appealed to me about it. That's what drew me in the first place to the somatic marker approach. It's a little bit unusual to find yourself getting into this literature as a political scientist, but it's something which I hope will become increasingly popular after this article is published. Let's hope so anyway. And the somatic marker theory is something I'm going to explain in a second. So what is the theory? What is the approach? What does it mean? What does it mean when we talk about the somatic marker theory? Well, there's a clue in the title, and the clue is soma, S-O-M-A. Soma means soma is ancient Greek for of the body, relating to the body, and it's part of the English language. The term somatic means of the body as well. And it's entered the English language some time ago, because when we talk about psychosomatic illness, that involves convincing yourself that you have a sickness. When you say that somebody has a psychosomatic illness, we mean that they've convinced themselves in their mind that they actually have a sickness of the body. And very often this is a misperception, a psychosomatic error. We talk about psychosomatic illness, and very often when we do that, we mean that somebody's been reading the medical dictionary and has convinced themselves that they have everything under the sun. And it's very easy to do that, by the way. You read a medical dictionary or you look online, look at WebMD, for instance. It's very easy to convince yourself after several hours of looking this material that you actually have the ailments which are described there. So somatic means of the body, and it's a significant clue about as to what the theory is about. The neuropsychologist, neuroscientist Antonio Damasio came out with a book in the mid-1990s called Descartes' Error, which summarizes the whole theory. And I'd certainly urge you to read that book if you're remotely interested in this area. I would look at Descartes' Error because it goes through in great detail what this whole theory is about. And Damasio is responsible for popularizing this approach, but he's not a political scientist by any stretch of the imagination. He's not an economist. But increasingly in the social sciences, we're turning to theories like the one in Descartes' Error to explain why people take the decisions that they do. So somatic is a significant clue. So what does the basic model involve? Basically, the model says that we all go through events and situations in life. That's pretty non-controversial, isn't it? We all meet people as we go through life. We go through events, we go through situations, very non-controversial kind of statement to make. But as we do that, the theory argues that we don't simply treat persons, situations in a neutral way. They become charged with emotion. They become marked as a result of experience, sometimes conscious experience, sometimes unconscious. But as we go through life, events, situations, people become marked, as it were, by emotion. They become somatically marked. And we subjectively interpret whether something is good or bad. We develop a somatic marker, as it were, in the body, in the mind, which subjectively interprets an experience or a person and tells us, is this good or is this bad? Is this something I want to repeat in the future? Do I want to meet this person again, or do I want to avoid them? Do I want to go through this situation again, or do I want to avoid it like the plague? So we subjectively interpret social reality as something good or as something bad. Now, here's the important thing about the theory. The theory doesn't end here, because it suggests that once we've developed these markers, when you encounter that personal situation again, or that kind of situation again, the original feeling in the body is reinstated. Feelings are visceral in that sense. You know what we mean by visceral? Visceral means deep down in the body, often refers to the gut. We talk about gut feelings, gut responses. Generally, the term visceral relates to bodily responses, physical responses. And the theory suggests that once we've developed these markers, when we encounter the same sort of situation again, the original feeling is reinstated. We feel the same thing again that we felt in the original situation. And that is not just something in the mind, it's something which we feel again in the body. So if we encounter the same situation again, we're going to feel to some extent like we did in the original situation. It's reinstated. The feeling is the same. So if it was something very unpleasant, the theory suggests that we actually feel that unpleasantness again. And it alerts us very quickly to the fact that this is something to be avoided. So, and this is why somatic markers are so useful. Why do they help decision making? Well, they help us rule out things very quickly that we know we don't like. And they help us rule in things very quickly that we know that we do like. They make decision-making a lot quicker because if we know what we want, we have these markers in our mind and our bodies, it becomes a very rapid process. And it shapes decision-making, but it's probably connected to evolution. Probably in the early, when human beings emerged from the primeval sludge, as it were, and as we developed into Homo sapiens, as we developed the way that we have, evolution has probably placed a premium on thinking fast rather than thinking slow, as Daniel Kahneman puts it. There were probably situations long ago, thousands of years ago, millions of years ago, where we had to think fast, where we're being traced by a lion or a bear or something like that. You're not going to survive if you make slow, ponderous decisions. And so we would have to think fast. And somatic markers would allow us to do that in an evolutionary sense. So there's probably an evolutionary advantage to using somatic markers in decision making. And maybe that's why you see it so often in foreign policy. And I'm going to give you some examples of that in a moment. But these are very useful things in decision making. And the first example I'll give you, very simple example, but I hope a revealing example, is the case of former President William McKinley. McKinley was president of the United States in the 1890s. And even though he's not available, obviously, to interview nowadays, he left behind his writings, and we know an awful lot about the kind of emotional experiences he went through as a result of those. And if you look at his early life, McKinley's early life, McKinley was actually at the Battle of Antietam in 1862. During the US Civil War, McKinley, as a young man, as a very young man, was a commissary sergeant at the Battle of Antietam for the Union during the Civil War. And during Antietam, which was the bloodiest battle in all of American military history, in fact, it still is the bloodiest battle. We often think of 9/11 as producing a lot of casualties. Only a few thousand people died during 9/11. 23,000 Americans died at Antietam. And so, as a young man at the battle, McKinley saw some quite appalling things. He saw horrendous suffering, and he saw quite literally bodies stacked up in a pile. And this was his introduction to war. Now, as you might imagine, that influenced him for the rest of his life. Forevermore, he was always against war. He was always against conflict because he'd been through that terrible experience at Antietam. And when he was president, much later in life, in 1898, the United States went into the Spanish-American War, fighting the Spanish over Cuba was what the war was about. And McKinley, even though a lot of people were urging him to get involved in the war, held off for an awful long time. He basically took the position that I don't want to get involved in another war of the kind that I got involved in as a young man. I've seen the bodies stacked up in piles already, he said, he quite explicitly said that in his diaries. And there's no way that I want to repeat that experience. that was such a searing, visceral, emotional experience for me that I don't want to ever repeat war, take the United States into war. So it had a major impact on him, and he held off until the very last minute, where the Congress effectively and public opinion forced McKinley's hand, forced him into fighting the Spanish through the Spanish-American War. But it's something which he clearly did not want to do, and he didn't want to do it because of that earlier experience. So it's a very simple example of a somatic marker. He developed that somatic marker as a result of the experience in the battle in 1862. And it was reactivated when people were talking about going into the Spanish-American War. It's a case of reactivation of a somatic marker. And it's a simple example of how this works in a foreign policy case. Give you another example, a second example, that's of former Secretary of Defense, US Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, during the Bin Laden raid, famous Bin Laden raid of 2011. Gates was somebody who had been through a very searing and emotional experience himself. He'd been one of the planners working for the CIA in 1980. He'd been one of the planners of the Iran hostage rescue mission, which, as you may know, was an absolute disaster from start to finish. And Gates was pretty convinced that it was all going to work in 1980. And Jimmy Carter gave the go-ahead in early 1980 for the mission to go ahead. And as the assistant in those days to the CIA director, Gates was an enthusiastic proponent of the rescue operation. And then it goes badly wrong. Almost everything you can imagine, I won't go into detail about it, but almost everything you can imagine going wrong does go wrong in that raid. And they end up having to come back to the USS Nimitz with the helicopters are taken off, not in disgrace, but knowing that the whole mission had been a disaster. So when many, many years later, Gates is defense secretary, the US defense secretary, during the Bin Laden raid of 2011. And the interesting thing is that Gates was almost alone amongst Barack Obama's advisors in saying that we should not attempt to launch a raid on the Bin Laden compound, not using human beings, at least. He believed that they should take a shot at Bin Laden from a drone, for instance, or using a missile from taking off from a ship. He did not believe in the rescue, not the rescue mission, but the operation which eventually went ahead in 2011, which captured and killed Osama bin Laden. He argued until he was blue in the face in many ways that it should not go ahead. And Obama didn't listen to him in the end. He went with the majority, which was suggesting to Obama that he should go ahead. And the interesting thing is that Gates was almost alone amongst the advisors to Obama in saying, no, don't do this. Because he knew exactly what a failed operation would feel like. He knew exactly what it was like to be part of a military operation which goes badly wrong, which goes awry. And that had happened to him in 1980, and he was stung by it in many ways. He was really affected by that experience. And so when the opportunity came along in 2011 to mount a raid on Bin Laden compound, Gates was very, very leery about trying that. He said, let's not put human beings into that volatile atmosphere. Let's not risk losing the pilots and the team of the SEAL Team 6 people who went in there, got Bin Laden. Let's not do that, because the whole thing might go badly wrong. And then as president, he told Obama, you're going to end up just the way that Jimmy Carter was after 1980. So he's stung by this experience, by the somatic marker, and he recommends very much against the operation, which eventually went ahead. Here's a quote from Gates recalling the 1980 mission. And he says that, quote, I remember to this day vividly driving home from the agency at about 1 o'clock in the morning, weeping because I was so convinced it would have worked. And then we lost all these brave people. He was physically, emotionally stung by that experience in 1980, and he was determined not to repeat it. In much the way that McKinley did not want to repeat his experience at Antietam, Gates did not want to repeat the Iran hostage rescue mission and subject the Obama presidency to the same humiliation. So he worked very much against that, and only really approved the mission at the last minute. He changed his mind at the last minute when Obama had already made the decision to go ahead. Gates was still quite leery about the operation and thought it was too risky, just too dangerous. So if you watch the movie Desert One, you'll see this quote in there where Gates says that he'd been stung by this memory of is very much affected to the point of breaking down crying in his car, because he was so convinced it would have worked, and it all became a huge disaster, and in some ways is responsible for Jimmy Carter's defeat in 1980. It certainly contributed to that. Probably the economy was the major thing, but the sense of impotence which Carter had in 1980, as compared to Reagan's feeling of supreme confidence, attitude of all-embracing confidence, seems to have definitely won the day in 1980. But people remembered 1980 and his humiliation at Desert One, and this is something which influences Gates's reasoning later on. Here's a final example. I won't label the examples too much, but Susan Rice is another really good example of a somatic marker and how these make a difference to the kind of advice that people give to presidents in American foreign policy. On the left, on the bottom, the left hand, you see a very young Susan Rice as she was in 1994. And she went through, as head of the UN peacekeeping desk at the National Security Council, in 1994 within the NSC in Washington, D.C. She was not responsible for, but presided over the Somalia disaster, the Rwanda disaster in 1994, where what happened was basically that a genocide occurred and the United States did not intervene to prevent the genocide from occurring. And it happened on Rice's watch. And as a result of that, she was stung by the experience. Again, McKinley and Gates, both examples being stung by experience. You see it too with Rice as well. She's stung by that Rwanda episode, by the fact the United States did not intervene, did not stop the slaughter, the genocide in Rwanda from going ahead. And there were pretty good reasons for doing that, which I won't go into here, but for one reason or another, we didn't intervene to stop that. And Rice was forever influenced by that. For instance, when she was National Security Advisor, again, many years later, in 2013, she was Barack Obama's National Security Advisor during the decision-making about Syria. And in Syria, if you recall, you may recall this from about 9 years ago, there was a big debate about what to do about Bashar al-Assad in Syria, who had gassed his own people, used poison gas on his own people, used chemical weapons on his own people in 2013. And the United States has said that it would not tolerate that it would be a red line. If Assad used chemical weapons, we would intervene. And then he went ahead and did it. So the debate was between those who thought we can't back down now because we said we were going to intervene. If he crosses this red line, we have to do it. Others said we should never have given that ultimatum because it now commits us to get involved in a very tricky war in Syria. And we should not be getting involved because our core national interest is not at stake here. And Rice disagreed with that. She was alone amongst Barack Obama's advisors in saying, we have to intervene in Syria. We can't allow this guy Assad to gas his own people. We can't allow him to attack his own people. This reminds me, she said, very much of the experience I went through in the Rwanda case. And he said that as in that case, Bill Clinton had been the president in 1994, and he has always been ashamed in later years by that Rwandan episode, because it was a case where the US could have intervened but didn't to stop the genocide, to stop the slaughter. And what if we had intervened? Shouldn't we have used the power of the presidency, the American presidency, to get involved in that situation? Rice has always argued that we should have. That experience, that emotional, searing experience, shows how important it is for the United States to get involved in these kinds of situations. And as Obama went round the table, as they discussed what to do about Assad in Syria, almost all of the advisors said, get out of Syria. This is not a core US interest. We should not be involved here. But Rice piped up and she said, no, I disagree with this, Mr. President. I think that we really should be involved here. And that you'll always regret it if you don't get involved. If you don't deal with the problem of Assad in Syria, you'll always regret it. not getting involved is something, a non-decision like Rwanda is something which you will very much regret. And so she was alone amongst the president's advisors in saying, you should get involved in this case. And this is one of the quotes. I won't go through the quote itself, but in her memoirs, Tough Love, she describes this incident to Rwanda. And she says, to this day, I'm still haunted. I stepped off a helicopter in Rwanda, and she actually went to Rwanda as part of a team of national security officials. And the helicopter landed, and she found herself, very surprisingly, right in the middle of a case of genocide. She found herself right in the middle of a school, a church where a genocide had taken place, and the bodies were thick on the ground. The corpses were decomposing. They were jammed so tight that it was treacherous to walk without stepping on one. Grown bodies, children's bodies, babies in mothers' arms, shot up, hacked up, decaying faces, frozen in the position they fell. It was a very, very emotional experience for her. And it comes out again in the Syria decision-making. So very, very searing experiences. And even though I've given bad experiences as examples of markers, it does work for pleasant experiences as well. If something's good, we tend to like to repeat it. If something feels bad, as in the McKinley case, the Gates case, the Rice case, we don't want to repeat it. We want to avoid it. But it gives us a very quick way of making decisions almost immediately. And as part of human evolution, we seem to develop this ability to make these kind of quick decisions. But it has to be said that it works best for individual decisions. Because when you're talking about advising a president in the United States, you're talking about a group process. And so not an individual process. So it works best for individual decisions. But having said that, it is a significant input into the group process. And I'll finish just by noting the use of somatic markers in supermarkets. I don't want to, unfortunately, I put Aldi at the top here. And I don't want to try and sell Aldi's as a supermarket, but it's one great illustration of how we use somatic markers in decision-making is the supermarket example. Because as we go into think about how easy it is for most of us to make rapid decisions in a supermarket. You're overwhelmed by choice. There are products everywhere. Thousands, tens of thousands of products. And yet we can go in there and pick out what we want very, very quickly. And Damasio would say the reason you can do that is somatic markers, is that you know what you like. You developed emotional attachments to particular products, and it may be conscious, often it's subconscious. But we develop these attachments to things, and it makes it very easy, very fast to make decisions. And so I'll leave it there. I'm deliberately racing through things to leave room for a question or two. I'm sure Jeff will want to kick things off.
No, thank you very much for that, David. And yes, I appreciate the way that it ended in a supermarket. Very good. Yes, I tend to be rather indecisive when it comes to going to the supermarket. So although there are all these choices, I always tend to fall back on what I've actually had before because I'm just unadventurous. But that's just me. No, I mean, you've sort of given us a lot to think about. I mean, just a couple of things that sort of struck me off the top of my head before I asked a question. I mean, in the first instance, when you talk about uh, you know, how it works, and in some cases, and you've given three examples of where it did have an impact with McKinley, Gates, and Rice. What's interesting, of course, is that the actual policy was the opposite one in each of
Yeah,
those cases. So in McKinley, he was against the war, but the war occurred anyway. In the case of
yeah,
Gates, he was against the raid, but it went ahead anyway. And in the case of
yeah,
Rice, she was in favor of intervention, but they chose not to intervene.
yeah,
Which is again, I think, sort of an interesting dynamic, but at least at the very least to show what their views were sort of at the time. They're sort of the natural instincts. I mean, McKinley's, for example, being very much sort of the anti-war person, but sort of having to go along with it. And in that sense, I was curious, sort of, is the opposite. You get somebody like Theodore Roosevelt, who was obviously pushing for the intervention in the case of Cuba in 1898.
mm,
Um, trying to sort of find what was it that was rolling the war in for him that was rolling it out for
mm,
McKinley. And in that sense, you could also find these other sort of study of opposites like Chamberlain and Churchill.
yeah,
Was Chamberlain so frightened from the experience of the First World War, for example, whereas Churchill had a very different view of war based perhaps upon his earlier experiences, and so on and so forth. Um, the Yeah, I mean, in the case of Syria, for example, that you mentioned, and I guess this applies both to Susan Rice and Robert Gates in 2011, the same year as the Bin Laden raid, was also the Libya War, and there you have people like Samantha Power basically saying we need to do the intervention in Libya because look what we didn't do in Rwanda back
yeah,
then, or in the case of Srebrenica or something like this in the Balkans. Whereas Gates, even in that case as well, was very hesitant to get involved in Libya, um, probably for different reasons, but still very much against it. So I mean, I do find this a sort of very very interesting approach. But I'm sort of just curious, sort of how do you isolate those incidents? As a political psychologist, political scientist, how do you when you're doing these cases, how do you actually isolate those experiences and say that's what accounted for their preference, not necessarily the end decision, but at least their preference of
mm.
A over B or something like this?
Well,
So if I could just
yeah,
add one more thing, so that in isolation of other factors like geopolitics or something like this.
yeah. Well, I think all of those things are still very important. It's it just goes to show that you can't focus purely on one element to the levels of analysis. All of your students will be acutely aware that in foreign policy analysis, you can't really isolate one particular level and say, let's just look at the system level of analysis or domestic politics or psychology of individuals. It's difficult to just do that and just to rule all of that stuff out. But I think in the example you've given, let me start with the Teddy Roosevelt case, because Teddy Roosevelt's a great example of somebody who has a somatic marker himself. And because if you look at Roosevelt's early life, as you probably were, he went through the early part as a very young man of the US Civil War himself. And his father, he was ashamed of his father, even though he venerated in many ways. He was ashamed that his father had never served in the US Civil War. And there was a difficulty in the Roosevelt household that his mother was Southern and his dad was Northern. And mother did not want her husband to go off to war in the North somewhere and be fighting her brothers. She was petrified by that idea that her husband would end up killing her brothers. And because of that, she insisted that he use a substitute. And they eventually they had a lot of debates, I think, in the household about this, as you might imagine. But Teddy Roosevelt eventually, the senior Roosevelt eventually decided to employ a substitute, which you then could do. He paid like $300 or where it was, $1,000, somebody else to fight for him. And he didn't want to do that, but he also wanted to keep his marriage intact. So he really had this conflict. I mean, how do you keep your marriage apart at the same time as be patriotic and serve your country? And this was the compromise he reached. But for the younger Roosevelt, for young Teddy Roosevelt, for TR, this was a source of family shame, I think. And I think you could see that as another somatic marker. The shame, the guilt that he felt from his dad not having served really had an impact on him. And a lot of the biographers of TR give that as an example of why he was so gung-ho. Why was he so in favor of war? Why did he think that war was splendid? It wasn't his phrase, splendid, it's somebody else's, but splendid little war is a term which comes from the Spanish-American War. But it's something which demands explanation. Why was he so gung-ho? I think it's related to that experience in so far as we can tell.
No, earlier today, we were discussing the Iraq War, and of course, this issue of George W. Bush and his father, the relationship with his father, and the impact.
Very similar, yeah.
Yes, actually, I'm just curious. What are your views on that case? Perhaps it's slightly different, slightly off topic, but only slightly.
Yeah, I do. I don't think that's a similar case to the TR one, in the sense that I think he developed some sort of somatic marker, as we would call it in this talk, that led him to believe that he should have emulated father. He should have done what the father failed to do. And I think, as somebody who had not served himself, he was remarkably similar to TR in many ways. So I do see a lot of parallels between that. Now, proving it is another matter. Whether you can ever prove it, maybe you have to wait until 100 years have passed before you can actually make that argument in print. But unless he admits it to the memoir, it's kind of hard to make that stick. But I think they are in similar kind of there are similar cases. But I also think that you talked about how the eventual presidential decision is counter to the somatic marker being argued by Gates and by Rice. Yes,
or even,
it is.
Or even by the president, himself.
Yeah.
In the case of McKinley.
And that partly relates to presidential style as well, I think, because Obama's style was very deliberate. It was very system 2 rather than system 1. If you look at Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, it's very system 2. It's very slow and ponderous. And Obama liked that kind of decision making.
Yes, well, I mean, one of the things that you mentioned at the start of your talk was, how do you choose between options, A, B, and C? In the case of sort of the surge decision, sort of the big one, the big surge in the autumn of 2009, I think he was sort of given options A, B, and C, and he said, "Well, I don't like any of those, but I'll sort of take a variation of B." I need to actually make my mark on that on the options, even though it's sort of it was such a minor issue that he's sort of saying, no, I need this changed slightly. Instead of 30,000 troops, I want 28 or 32 or whatever it was. But basically, it was very, very minor difference. Can I ask? I mean, this issue about sort of how one feels about oneself. I mean, obviously, when you're a president or some sort of senior official like that, engage in decisions, especially about going to war or intervention or something like this. On the one hand, there's sort of how one feels about oneself, but is there not also the idea that there's also an assumption about how the population will feel, how voters will feel, and then sort of a gut instinct about that? Do you see any evidence of that pop up in any of these cases.
Yeah, I think so. You have certainly you have it in the McKinley case, don't you? Where the two things which really forced McKinley's hand in that example are the Spanish-American War are Congress and public opinion. Both of those are heavily in favor of getting involved. I think you have to remember also that at the time, the presidency was not as, quote, modern as it is today in the United States. It was not as, had not developed its own foreign policy powers in the way that happened after McKinley, under Teddy Roosevelt and under Woodrow Wilson. So McKinley faced a system in which Congress had a great deal more of the impact on whether we went to war. And they passed so many resolutions in favor of war in that case that McKinley basically had no option, had no choice.
Well, this is also a case that I often find with especially feminist scholars who say, well, there's this jingoistic attitude or sort of jingoistic discourse. It was in the air. It was very, very common, and for him not to take action, he would be viewed as weak, as being too feminine. Therefore, he had to he had to act masculine by going to war.
Yeah.
So again, sort of related to this question, perhaps of perceived inferiority and how voters will interpret that, or something to that effect. The other thing I was going to ask was, you used you sort of said at the very beginning of your talk, you referred to, I think, specifically same situations, but of course they're never the same or not quite the same. They might be vaguely similar in the sort of general ballpark or something like this. But sort of, it's always the question of sort of how one actually, and maybe this goes back to the whole issue about analogies. One has to sort of make that analogy mentally that this is actually sort of in the ballpark before one actually says, okay, based upon that analogy, this is how I feel, or have I got that back to front?
No, I think you have. I think, but over the years, I've come to realize this is more that analogical reasoning is more, when we really mean it, it's probably more of a bodily process than we ever thought possible. It's something which you feel in your gut, this situation is similar. And it doesn't really matter if it's different in a lot of ways, because the body kind of decides for you whether this is similar or not. And often it's wrong. Sometimes we refer to the gut as the second brain. And I think it is, in some ways, it often takes our decisions for us. But I always remember the case of on 9/11. I think I may have given you this example before, but on 9/11, the morning of 9/11, I dropped my kids off in nursery in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I drove back to the house from the nursery with my father-in-law, who's deceased now, but he was in his late 80s, and he could remember the 40s and 50s and beyond that, 20s and 30s even. And when we turned on the radio on morning of 9/11, as we were going back to the house, we heard that the first plane had hit the World Trade Center, and he immediately said, used an analogy, he said, this is just like when that plane hit the Empire State Building in 48 or 47, I think it was. And he said, oh, this is another accident. So his mind, his body basically, but it was like he was driving. So he certainly didn't have time to think, are these similar or different or anything. I think it's basically his body, his gut reaction was, this is similar. And of course, that was a very misleading analogy, because that had been a civilian accident. This was something deliberate, as we now know. But initially, he made sense of that, bodily, I think. it just came into his gut, as it were, that
Yes.
this is similar. So I think the body, as I've been suggesting, has a lot to do with analogical reasoning. I used to think of it as, when you compare one case with another, as being a very cold analytical process, but it's not. It's the people who really mean the analogies they use. It's things like Rwanda, things like Antietam popping into people's mind because they physically feel it. They
Yes.
feel it in their gut, just how awful this was. And Gates could feel how awful it was to fail at Desert One, and they didn't want to do it again. Indeed.
So if I could just ask one final question before I bring this to a close, because one question that I sometimes get from students is, when it comes to things like analogies and so forth, how do you find them, and sort of, are there enough of them to actually make a good case? And I mean, obviously I've read your book on the hostage crisis and so forth, and there are obviously similar works like Kong's book and so forth. But I'm just sort of curious, especially with some more recent cases as well that you've looked at, or even older cases like going back to McKinley, when are you relying more on memoirs as opposed to meeting transcripts or memos, or something like this? I mean, I guess, to what extent are you confident that is the emotion that you're effectively capturing? I mean, presumably, for instance,
Yeah.
in a memoir, you sort of remember enough to put it in the memoir. So hopefully it was actually sort of the real emotion, as opposed to some sort of post hoc justification or whatever like this. But
Yeah. I
okay.
see what you're saying. That definitely is a problem, because we rely upon people to tell us in their memoirs what emotion they were feeling. And there's no reason for people to lie for McKinley to lie about Antietam, or for Rice to lie about Rwanda. I think it's quite compelling when they talk about these things, but that they really did experience these emotions. But one of the reasons for focusing on cases like this in a talk of this kind is because it's less ambiguous. It's pretty clear what Rice was feeling as the helicopter landed in that field of devastation in Rwanda in 1994, and it's pretty clear what Gates was feeling as he drives home in tears after the rescue mission fails. And so I think by focusing on cases which are extreme in that sense, it highlights the role which emotion always plays in our reasoning. And so what I'm trying to do, I think, in using these cases in the article with Alvaro Mendez, what we're trying to do is trying to bring out the role which emotion always plays in human reasoning. And the supermarket example, by the way, I want to get that in before we finish, is a great one to use, because there are people who have had damage to the emotional centers of the brain. For instance, there's a woman called Tammy Myers who had a motorcycle accident which damaged her prefrontal cortex, which is more or less here, between our eyes, is the prefrontal cortex. And that is the decision-making center of the brain, but it's also the emotional center in some ways of the brain, apart from the amygdala. It's a major emotional center. And the interesting thing about people like Tammy, who've had that accident or have had a brain disease which eats away at the prefrontal cortex, is that they can't make decisions anymore. Tammy Myers ostensibly recovered from that accident, but then after she'd recovered physically, she went back into places like supermarkets, and she tried to make decisions and was overwhelmed by choice, because she now lacked emotion, and she now lacked somatic markers, as Damasio would see it, to make the decision-making simple. And what somatic markers do for us is to speed up the process and make it simple. Otherwise, we're simply swamped by choice. We can't decide because there's too much. The supermarket is a great example of that, I think, because there's so many products, the millions of products just looking at you, and it's easy to imagine that you'd be swamped by that. And yet
Yes.
we can do it right away, most of us. I know you said you find it difficult, but
No. Why actually probably a more useful analogy to use in that sense is actually, if ever I have a bad experience at a restaurant, I tend not to go back to that restaurant.
yeah. Well, that's a great simple example of it.
So that's about as simple and as truthful as I can sort of make it. But,
yeah, Sebastian would say that's a simple somatic marker. That's you had a negative experience, you'll never go back to that. And I of course did the same thing.
Yes, under duress. Look, as it's now 5 p.m., I'm afraid I need to bring this to a close. So, David, thank you so much for your presentation, which I always find enlightening, and always learning something new. And I love always how you're presenting new cases, and also in your paper with Alvaro Mendez, you also refer to Madeleine Albright and Cyrus Vance. So a couple of other cases as well. So when that does become more widely available next year, I hope others will read it as well. I read it earlier and I thought it was absolutely superb. So I can't recommend it highly enough. This is actually the final talk for this semester. We'll be resuming the seminar probably sometime in late January, and we will keep you posted on that. So thank you very much, and have a good day.